G'day, welcome to Saturday Agenda. I'm David Lipson. On the program today, the High Court has again scuttled the Commonwealth's funding of chaplains in schools. The Prime Minister wants the program to continue, but not everyone believes the taxpayer should be paying for religious counselling in schools and excluding secular counselling. We'll have that later on the program. First, asylum seekers, and the government has increased significantly the amount of money being offered to asylum seekers as incentives to return to their home countries. Under Labor, asylum seekers were offered up to $2,000 to abandon their attempts to gain entry into Australia. And according to Fairfax Papers today, they're now being offered up to $10,000 depending on individual circumstances. Well, joining me now to discuss this and other issues of the day is Liberal MP Kelly O'Dwyer and Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs Matt Thistlethwaite. First to you, Kelly O'Dwyer. Can you confirm these payments and why has the government increased them?
Well, what I can confirm is that payments are paid to individuals who are returning home, and those individuals are returning home in an environment where it is deemed safe for them to return home. It is done on a basis whereby individual circumstances are taken into consideration. We want to make sure that when people return home that they are set up for success. Obviously, many of them have spent quite a lot of money in trying to come to Australia through paying people smugglers huge amounts of money, and when they go home we want to make sure that they are properly resettled back there.
So this isn't aimed so much at clearing out the detention facilities that are currently operating offshore, for example?
These are all people who are voluntarily returning home, and as I said to you before, it's safe for them to return home. It is simply to allow them and their families to set their lives back up when they do return home, and it's done on an individual basis.
Matt Thistlethwaite, Labor offered similar payments. Do you have any problem with the Coalition offering more generous payments?
Well, David, if the story is factual, I think you have to ask the question, why has there been such a dramatic increase in the amount of this payment? And that's related to the fact that this government has completely messed up the process of processing asylum seekers, particularly at Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. Labor envisaged that an important aspect of the regional resettlement arrangement with Papua New Guinea was that people would be assessed in accordance with UN conventions and Papua New Guinean law and processed in a timely manner. The Cornell report into the death of Reza Barati clearly indicated that delays in processing, a sense of hopelessness amongst asylum seekers, were the reason for the tension and the eventual riot on Manus Island. So the government's completely messed this process up, and now they're having to increase these payments.
So you're suggesting that the government has increased the payments to try to speed up the process of getting people out of detention facilities?
Well, I think there's no doubt that this government has messed up that process. It took Scott Morrison 8 months before he actually held a meeting with his Papua New Guinean counterpart about the importance of and the details of how you would process people who were in Manus Island Detention Centre. Now, clearly that's not good enough, and that's led to a lot of the unrest that we've seen in Manus Island and the delays.
Well, David, can I respond to that? Yeah, because look, I mean that, you know, Matt, you can assert what you like, but it's just factually incorrect. The important point to note here is that under Labor scheme, more than 50,000 people arrived unauthorised by boat, 30,000 of whom were dumped into detention and not processed. We are now going through the backlog of those people who weren't processed under Labor. They didn't process people for more than 12 months. This is simply not acceptable, and it is not correct for Matt to make the assertion that we are not processing people in a timely manner. Labor created this problem. We are trying to fix it.
Well, this relates
and a final comment, Matt?
Yeah, this relates to people who were transferred to Papua New Guinea, to Manus Island, and clearly that's under the regional resettlement arrangement that was signed in July of this year. That's when
we're going through your backlog, though, in addition.
Began to stop, and that's the reason why we've seen the tension on the island, and that's clearly identified in the independent Cornell report.
Well, the situation in Iraq is only going to see more people fleeing their homes. There is a very large number, as we know, of asylum seekers all around the world, displaced people. We're seeing proof today in Iraq of Australia's or Australians' direct involvement in this conflict. Take a look at this clip.
All my brothers in Australia, I don't see myself better than any of you. And alhamdulillah, it's only that Allah has been Kareem on me and He's bringing me here to this country. So this is the message I wanna send to you. A message that inshallah from a Muslim brother's heart to another brother's heart.
This is pretty chilling stuff to see a guy with an Australian accent involved in such brutality in Iraq, the Islamic uprising and part of ISIS that's going on there. Kelly O'Dwyer?
Well, it's very disturbing, and what we know is that there are more than 150 Australians onshore and offshore who have involvement with extremist groups. What is particularly disturbing about the video we just saw is that we know that there are people actually fighting over in Syria, and some of them have actually gone as well to Iraq. Those people who are fighting are not there on a tourist holiday. They are there to cause death and destruction, and in Australia, we will do whatever we need to do to make sure that any Australian who seeks to return from overseas is locked up. If they have committed a criminal act, and we know that they have done that overseas, they can be locked up for 25 years. We can cancel passports, and that has been done. We can also put people on protection orders, control orders, where we know what they're doing and where they're going. And we also have the ability, where we think that people are an imminent terrorist threat in Australia, to also detain them.
Matt Thistlethwaite, is Labor satisfied that the government is doing enough to ensure that people either don't come back into Australia once they've been radicalised, or are stopped at the border, arrested or otherwise?
That footage you just showed, David, is extremely concerning, and it is a crime for any Australian to train with, to be involved with or work with a prescribed terrorist organisation. And when Labor was in government, we cancelled passports on the advice of ASIO for anyone who'd been involved in such activities, and I think it's appropriate for the government to be looking at using these measures again in this circumstance, and they'd have the full support of Labor to do so.
Kelly O'Dwyer, what about the Australian troop detail that has been deployed to Baghdad to protect the Australian embassy there? Should any Australians be concerned about mission creep, about being drawn further into this conflict?
Well, look, what we're making sure that we're doing is over in Iraq, making sure that the people who are working very hard on our behalf in the embassy over there are as safe as they can be, given the conflict that is going on. And we have sent people over there, a small detail over there, to ensure their safety, and if they are not safe, to ensure that they can be properly evacuated if the need arises.
Matt Thistlethwaite, should we still be in Baghdad? Should the Australian embassy be open at this time?
Well, David, Labor supports the deployment of a small ADF liaison unit to protect the interests of Australian citizens working in the embassy, and indeed Australian citizens who are still in Baghdad. It's an appropriate action for the government to take to protect the interests of Australian citizens, given the tension that's occurring in Iraq at the moment and the humanitarian disaster that's unfolding. We think that this is an appropriate action, and it has Labor's support.
And just on that Australian we saw earlier, Kelly O'Dwyer, what's happening in this country, do you think, that is seeing a reasonably large number of Australians, up to 150 as you mentioned, going into a war zone to fight for such a radical cause and be engaged in such awful violence?
Well, look, I can't put my finger on exactly what is motivating these people to engage in hate and violence, but it is simply not going to be tolerated. And we have, as Matt pointed out before, I know under the previous Labor government, ASIO did advise when passports needed to be cancelled. We have done the same thing. More than 40 passports have in fact been cancelled by people who have been engaged in these activities with extremist groups overseas. We do not want that being brought back to Australia, and we do not want people spreading messages of hate here or being engaged in violence onshore in Australia. And we will do everything that we can to make sure that that does not occur. We have been investigating as well those people who are Australian citizens, whether or not they should be able to still remain as Australian citizens. That's obviously very complex. That is something that we are looking very seriously at.
And Matt, what do you think about, looking locally in Australia? Is there anything that we're not doing that you think we should be doing to ensure that Aussies aren't going into these war zones to engage in this stuff?
Well, as I pointed out earlier, David, it's a crime for Australians to be involved in these sort of activities with prescribed terrorist organisations. So there's the full backing and force of the Australian criminal justice system, working with the advice of ASIO and experts in this field. What's going on in Iraq appears to be a sectarian dispute, which is getting quite serious. I think what's important is that somehow the Iraqi government needs to try and re-establish security around the capital and eventually try and get to a process of having the government meet again. I understand that that's the reason why many of the politicians fled the capital, because of security concerns and concerns for the welfare of themselves and their families. The Parliament's been unable to meet and reassure the public of the necessary security for the welfare of the people. So that's got to be the principal focus of trying to end this sectarian violence and restoring security to the capital.
OK, we've got to take a break, but after this we will come back and look in detail at the High Court's decision to scuttle the school chaplains' funding arrangement, and also ask the broader question, well, should we be funding religious counselling in public schools? Stay with us.
Honestly, times are tough. So I wasn't going to get tablets for everyone, but then I saw the new Windows tablet. It's got the familiar desktop, USB port, and it runs full Office. Compared to the others, it's a tablet that works for work. Plus, it's got apps, like Xbox games and Halo. For after hours, of course. I just couldn't come up with a reason not to buy them.
Save at Australia's biggest stocktake sale with weekend offers like 30% off full-price women's footwear by Sandler, Jane Debster and more, and 30% off full-price men's casual shirts and tees. Cannot be used with other offers in Sunday.
It's time to power up with Battery World's end of financial year sale. Buy one cordless phone battery, get one free. Buy one coin cell battery, get one free. Power up with more bargains galore at Battery World. Keeps you switched on.
Zeke, why is our car now orange?
Well, data shows that orange cars are very safe.
I guess it's a cute color.
Great! The house is next.
I bet the neighbors will love that.
Right now, get Budget Direct's smarter online discounts. 20% off car insurance and 30% off home and contents insurance. Get a quote today.
Smarter, cheaper, winner!
Pick up an Isuzu D-Max with a 5-star end of financial year deal. Like the D-Max 4x4 LSM for just $39,990 drive away. Plus, get a $1,000 gift card across the D-Max range. Visit your Isuzu Ute dealer today.
The Queensland Government's plan to deal with the state's $80 billion debt problem follows one of the biggest public consultations in Queensland's history. We've already cut waste. Now our plan includes the sale or lease of some assets. Not everyone will agree with every part of our plan, but Queenslanders do agree that strong choices are essential to fund the schools, hospital upgrades, roads and highways we need for Queensland's growing future. Authorised by the Queensland Government, Brisbane.
Viewpoint this week, the strategic, sectarian and extremist nightmare unfolding in Iraq and Syria. I'll have an expert panel to look at the causes, dangers and possible solutions. Join me for Viewpoint, live on Sky News.
Thanks for your company on Saturday Agenda. Arguably, one of the most ideological elements of the budget this year was the increase in funding for chaplains in schools to the tune of $250 million, while specifically excluding non-religious counsellors from the program. The High Court this week, for the second time, ruled the way this program is being funded is invalid. Not everyone believes the taxpayer should be funding religious staffing of public schools. One of them is Penny Wright from the Greens, and I want to bring her into our conversation. We are still joined by Matt Thistlethwaite and Kelly O'Dwyer as well. Penny Wright, what are the Greens' major concerns with this program?
Good morning, David and Matt and Kelly. Look, the chaplaincy program has always been a contentious program from when it was first introduced by John Howard to introduce Christianity into public schools. But at a time when the federal government is ripping $30 billion out of funding for education, which means that students with disabilities and students with other disadvantage won't be getting the improvements that we've been waiting for, it's a very bad idea to be putting $250,000 into this chaplaincy program.
A quarter of a billion dollars
quarter of a million, sorry, 250 million, yeah.
The Greens have said that they want professional mental health workers in schools instead. Can you just clarify, does that mean child psychologists? What do you mean by that?
Yes. At the moment, we have the government saying this is about welfare, but we actually have a crisis in youth mental health in Australia now. More teenagers actually die by suicide than in car accidents, and we are hearing from principals, from teachers, from school parents that they actually want qualified mental health services for students in schools and not amateurs doing welfare, which sometimes works well and sometimes doesn't. So we would be asking for the money to be redirected to services like psychologists, mental health workers, mental health social workers, so that the students who really need assistance can actually get professional assistance.
$250 million wouldn't go far, though, spread across the nation. If we're talking about professional psychologists, it wouldn't buy too many of them on a national level.
It wouldn't, indeed. We would need to augment that funding, of course, but at least it would be a start. And what many people are telling me, and it's been consistent Greens policy, that we need to keep, public schools have a right to have independence from religion. Religion is a fine thing, and I respect people's right to have a religion, of course, and I admire people who believe in something bigger than themselves, but it is a private matter. And in Australia we have a proud history of public education being secular, and so it's important that money that we are putting into welfare is actually going to qualified professional mental health workers.
Kelly O'Dwyer, I'll bring you into this conversation. The chaplains in schools are specifically not allowed to proselytise. You know, does that alleviate Penny Wright's concerns? But also, why are they only allowed to be Christian chaplains? Why not other religious leaders or counsellors if that's what you're going for?
Right. Well, first, you know, I'd like just to pick up on a couple of things that Penny has said in response to your questions, David. The first point is we are not cutting education spending in this budget. In fact, it is increasing over the forward estimates, 8% this year, 8% next year, 8% the year after, and around 6% the following year. So that's point number one. There isn't a cut to the education budget. Point number two is that schools already have welfare plans in place. The chaplaincy program is not a replacement for a school welfare plan. It is in addition to a school welfare plan. And the chaplaincy programs are not something that is a requirement of schools to have. It is something that schools themselves may ask for. The third point I want to make is that school chaplains aren't simply only Christian school chaplains. We have had examples of school chaplains from other religions working in schools. Many schools find this of benefit for their students, but it's obviously a question for the schools, for the principal and for the parent community there. If they
But
would like
why
that,
specifically exclude non-secular counsellors? I mean, what's the case? Because that's what Labor
because
had
that's
in
something that
place.
should already that's something that schools should already have in place. Schools should already have in place, based on their funding currently, a welfare plan. That's not something that the Commonwealth needs to fund. That's something that should already be in place as a result of state funding. Let's not forget the primary responsibility here is for the states to be able to properly fund their schools, and they should already be doing just that. So schools should already have that in place. This is in addition to that, and that's why I think some of this debate has been somewhat confused. I think some people are a little unclear of what the current facts are, and hopefully today I've been able to provide you with a little bit more information about what's actually part of this program.
Matt Thistlethwaite, Labor supported the school chaplains program when it was in government, but doesn't support this exclusion of secular counsellors, as I understand it, but does support the government finding a way to fund this program because of the implications of the High Court ruling on other programs. Can you just clarify that position? Is that right, or what's your view?
Yeah, that's correct, David. Labor never supported funding exclusively school chaplains. We believe that the funding also should have been provided to ensure that welfare officers and counsellors in schools that didn't want specifically a chaplain had the choice. And Kelly talks about choice. Well, there's no choice in this government's program because it specifically excludes welfare officers and counsellors, and Labor believes that that funding should have been extended to those services as well. But the concerning feature of this High Court decision, David, is the fact that there's almost 400 government programs that are now at risk, and they include programs such as drought funding for farmers, payments to local governments for roads, payments to private schools for infrastructure. That's now in doubt. And Labor has said that we'll work with the government.
It's not in doubt, Matt.
Well, no, they are, Kelly. They are.
No. It was a very specific High Court ruling on this particular program. None of those programs are in doubt.
But the principle...
It may have implications, though. Yeah. They could be open to challenge now, as I understand it.
The principle on which this decision was founded was the basis that the Commonwealth didn't have the legislative power under Section 51 under a specific head of power to grant these payments. That means that all other programs where there's no specific head of power, such as payments to local government, are now at risk. Now, there's perhaps a way to rectify that by going through the state's power, but that would require intense negotiation with the states. That's what Labor had in mind with the Gonski reforms. That's why we got the states on board.
Can I come in there, David? I'd like to comment a bit. First of all, on what Kelly said. Kelly said that Australia doesn't need the Commonwealth Government to be involved in the welfare program. The Minister representing the Minister for Education and Estimates made it very clear that the basis of the chaplains program is about welfare for students, because they were not able to explain what's the difference between someone who has a religious training and the welfare they can provide as opposed to others. But the other thing I'd say is this is utter hypocrisy on the part of the government, because they are so busy. We have a Minister for Education talking about autonomy for schools, that schools should have autonomy, increased independence, and yet one very clear thing that the government's intent on doing is taking away the ability of schools to determine whether they want to have a secular welfare worker or indeed they have to have a religious chaplain or no one at all. The other thing I'd say is that if the government is intent on retaining this contentious program, then don't sneak it through in an appropriations package where it's tied grant funding to the states. Put it out there, make it a legislative program and give the Parliament the ability to actually scrutinise it. Because one other thing the government has been saying is they will not tie the hands of the states. They'll give money for education, no strings attached, as they've done with Queensland and Western Australia. They will not dictate to states what they spend their money on. And yet what we're hearing is that they will give some kind of tied funding for a specific religious program for chaplaincy to the states and require them to spend the money on that. There's hypocrisy everywhere you look.
Kelly O'Dwyer, is there a few, or are there a few conflicting messages there, particularly on autonomy?
Well, no, there aren't. And with the greatest of respect to Penny, what I would say is this. No school is actually forced to have this program. And in terms of welfare, you know, we're not suggesting for 1 minute that these school chaplains are trained psychologists or psychiatrists. That is not their purpose, that is not their role. And to sort of conflate these issues is not representing it properly or factually. What we're simply suggesting is that a lot of independent schools have the benefit of having school chaplains. Now, obviously, they pay for that, and we're simply opening it up for a number of other schools in the government sector that, if they want, they can have a school chaplain. They don't have to. It is a matter for them. So there's nothing unusual in the government being able to provide specific programs, tied grants. That's something that's happened under Labor. It's something that's happened under our government. We're simply trying to maintain our election commitment. It's something we did commit to last time. It's something, in fact, Labor committed to as well, which is why it's interesting that we're hearing a few sort of weasel words today from Matt.
All right, well, we are out of time. Kelly O'Dwyer, Penny Wright and Matt Thistlethwaite, thank you for your company on Saturday Agenda today. And thanks for your company at home. I'm David Lipson. The news is next.